Hello all, I'm Niall Paterson and welcome back to the Daily, where we're all getting a touch of general election fever. OK, first of all, do not panic. I can hear Brenda from Bristol saying, "You're joking."
Not another one?
We do not yet have a date, and it could potentially be as late as January 2025. That said, it does feel as if the parties are moving up through the gears. Certainly, Rishi Sunak is giving every impression of being in campaign mode. Plenty of announcements, including on climate and energy security, also house building, even transgender rights. Labour, well, they may be significantly ahead in the polls, but the Tory attack line that only the government is prepared to make hard decisions whilst Labour flip-flops and prevaricates, well, it might just be having an effect. So how does Labour play this, particularly when the Tories are seeking to exploit wedge issues, those more controversial or divisive areas of policy? Later, I'll be speaking to two former senior Labour advisers. But we begin with a man who knows a thing or two about general elections and how they are won, and indeed lost, our chief political correspondent, Jon Craig. Jon, good to hear from you.
Good to speak to you, Neil.
So, the Conservatives, fighting back, or are they fighting for their lives? There's been a bit of a flurry from the Conservatives recently.
I think it's fair to say they're fighting back. I mean, yes, it's true that most Tory MPs are pretty gloomy about their prospects. They look at the opinion polls. They look at the dreadful result the Tories had in 2 of the 3 by-elections we had a week or so ago. But the thing, of course, that has really seems to have spurred them on in a fight back, particularly on energy issues and green issues, is the fact that they managed to hold on in Boris Johnson's old seat of Uxbridge and South Ruislip, but with a one-issue campaign, really, against Sadiq Khan's ULEZ proposals. And since then, of course, we've seen the Prime Minister declare in a Sunday Telegraph interview, "I'm on the motorist side." He's ordered a review of anti-car schemes. The Tory candidate for London Mayor has said that she will oppose the ULEZ in her campaign, and that the Tories clearly see a Labour weakness here. And this claim by the Prime Minister that he's on the side of the motorist, despite the fact he doesn't use a car much, he prefers to use a helicopter. Well, he does. Don't laugh. He does.
Well, it's the most efficient use of his time, Jon, as Rishi Sunak said. You're not telling me, Jon, that Rishi Sunak's man of the people credentials are perhaps somewhat lacking?
They're tosh, aren't they? I don't know. I'm probably being grossly unfair here, but
I don't know, Jon. Maybe. But looking at the policy portfolio which he is putting forward, and sometimes I do wonder when people describe things as populist, whether or not they actually ultimately mean popular. Look at the stuff that he has been doing on energy and climate change recently, announcing that there will be new licences for North Sea gas and oil exploration. Now, as our own Ed Conway has pointed out, that materially that will not really make much of a difference to how much we consume in this country. However, it doesn't feel a policy very much of the moment, but he's doing it presumably because he believes that it cuts through and maybe throws a bit of red meat to some within his own party.
Well, since that by-election when the Conservatives pulled off a fairly, what some would say was an unexpected win in Ruislip, as soon as I got to the count, I asked an old local government veteran who doesn't have an axe to grind, "What do you think?" And he said that at the beginning, Labour thought they were going to win this by-election comfortably. They have totally underestimated the unpopularity of ULEZ. Now, since then, the Tories have, as you say, absolutely jumped on the anti-green bandwagon. Now, let's take North Sea oil first of all. Ed Miliband and Sir Keir Starmer have said no more licences North Sea oil, no more fossil fuels. Well, the Prime Minister has hit back by saying that we're better to produce our own oil and gas than have to buy it from Putin or anywhere else abroad, the Middle East perhaps. And that's an argument that will probably sway with some people. The other thing the Tories have done is Grant Shapps, who's quite an effective campaigner, he keeps talking about Just Stop Oil and their political wing, the Labour Party.
And what is Just Stop Oil's primary purpose? No more North Sea oil and gas.
Indeed.
I should say.
So there we have, first of all, North Sea oil, big dividing line between Conservatives and Labour. Then let's go talk about the motorists again. I mean, the Tories are not only anti-ULEZ, the Prime Minister is saying he's ordered a review of anti-car schemes, as he calls them, these low-traffic neighbourhoods, which critics argue just create traffic jams outside them.
But this is not, of course, the totality of the Conservative strategy at the moment, along with
It's one part of it, yeah.
Totally. But the other part of it is pointing to every single occasion on which it could be perhaps said or at least argued that Keir Starmer has flip-flopped. I mean, I'm wondering what your thoughts are on this, because, we are still a bit of a distance for the next general election. The opposition doesn't need to set out their stall entirely right now.
That's what they argue, certainly, yes, that he and Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor, had determined not to make spending commitments. There was a television interview a couple of weeks ago where the leader of the Labour Party just slipped out very quickly. He was asked, what are you going to do about the cap on child benefit, capped at 2 children? Oh, we're not going to change that. Well, that upset a lot of people in his own party. But that was a classic example of Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves not making any promises so that the Tories could say, oh, that would cost billions of pounds. You'd have to put up taxes. I mean, what has happened in recent weeks is that really the gloves have come off on both sides. And there have been plenty of people who think, oh, good, this is a good thing. And there are others who think it's all very descending into the gutter.
So that is indeed the position as taken forward by the Conservatives. Thanks very much, John. So let's see what the response should be from Labour. And let's bring in Andrew Fisher, former Labour Director of Policy under Jeremy Corbyn, Jon McTernan, former Political Secretary to Tony Blair. John, to you first. I mean, if you read the newspapers, you would assume that the next election is Labour's to lose, is it?
It is Labour's to lose, but I think it's about a bigger issue than that. It's really the planet's to lose. If the Tories, in a desperate attempt to shore up their vote on the right, are making this into a referendum on getting to net zero, let's make the next election a referendum on getting to net zero and getting to net zero faster. Look, Labour have been dominant in 770 polls, I think, certainly since September 21. So that's the second half of the parliament so far. It doesn't look like there's any recovery from the Tories. Their flailing is desperate. They've decided now what their strategy is going to be. And I think Labour can beat them on that because there are so many other issues.
I mean, Andrew, clearly the environment will be an issue at the next election. Is the Labour policy portfolio enough to make sure that they win a majority, and they win a sizable majority?
Well, I think the Tories setting fire to the economy, to public services, to the climate is enough to guarantee Labour the next election. The question is really, are Labour's policies enough when they get into power? And I think we've seen a bit of a wobble over the last week from Labour as well, over ULEZ in London because of the Uxbridge result. And I think really the lesson for Labour is that the crisis is the reason to be bolder, not to draw back and be more cautious. There's lots of things you can do straight away and quite urgently on climate, and that affects everything. It affects how you build housing, how you fund public services, lots of other things as well. So I think Labour do need to be bolder, because actually the real issue, really, the real challenge for Labour is, are they going to be bold enough in government on a range of issues, not just the environment?
John, just popping your kind of backroom strategist hat on just for a second. I mean, why did Labour get into such a flap over ULEZ? I mean, they must have known it was going to be an issue.
Look, by-elections are always about an issue. Boris was meant to be the issue, but he was popular in the local constituency. The Tories found an issue, and the reason why Labour has been focusing on this issue in its head office is obvious. Labour lost a by-election it should have easily won, when the swing across the country should have given us that seat easily. Labour does really need to listen. And I think the one thing that is clear about the strategy that Rishi Sunak has now adopted is that he's trying to adopt the on your side mantra. Because really all politics in the end is a race between being on your side and making sure the other guy is out of touch. Labour look out of touch unless they respond to a result. When you lose, you have to say, we're listening. Otherwise, you look like you're just arrogant. And I think Labour can't afford to look arrogant, taking votes for granted, any voters of any sort for granted.
Okay, Andrew, I can understand John's point as regards ULEZ, but then why are we not seeing perhaps the boldness that you are talking about when it comes to environmental policy in general? I mean, it does seem when you speak to kind of senior figures within the party, it's all about keeping tinder dry, yes, but at the same time, not knowing financially what this next Labour government, if it does indeed become a Labour government, what they might be able to do.
Well, look, there's lots you can do. And, you go back to the 1945 election, Clement Attlee's party inherited a debt 2.5 times bigger than what Keir Starmer will inherit in 2024 or early 2025. They didn't say, oh, let's row back on our plans for the welfare state or the NHS, that'll have to wait, or we better not take into public ownership of, somewhere between a quarter and a fifth of industry. They were bold, they got on with things and did it. So I think we need to see the same commitment from Labour, because as Jon points out, it's about trying to be on your side. And Sunak thinks he's alighted on something, I'm on the motorist side. Labour needs to set out where the financial benefits are for people from their policies. And I think that's the thing that's missing, because at the moment we're seeing a kind of drawing in, or we can't afford to do that. We can't afford universal free school meals. We can't afford to end the 2-child cap, or we better delay our climate investment. Where's the offer for Labour? And I think that's the bit that's missing at the moment. I still think because of the damage the Tories have done to the economy, to our public services, to the climate, the failure on housing, that Labour are in prime position. But it's not absolutely set in stone. These things never are. And Labour do need to give people an enthusiastic reason to vote for them, not just a rejection of the Tories.
Yeah, I mean, and Jordan, when it comes to environmental issues, and ULEZ is perhaps an example of this, but just in general, I mean, isn't part of the reason that we aren't hearing more from Keir Starmer and others because we don't know when the next general election is going to be?
No, absolutely. I mean, last year, I was talking to an Australian friend, and we both agreed the next election, the most likely date, is January 2025. We've got 15, maybe 18 months till the next election. This government normally has 2 fiscal events every year. So we could be 3 fiscal events away from the next election. So although we know the situation is going to be incredibly difficult when we get into the next election, and after that, if we become the government, we don't know the exact shape of it. So I think it's going to be very difficult for Labour to know what the actual numbers are, to know when the firing gun is going to be shot. But we will have to have, and I expect the beginnings of it, a conference in October, of what the retail offer is, what the specificity is, what it means for every one of our listeners, every one of Sky's viewers.
But Jon, just to keep with you for a second, I mean, as you well know, criticism of the leader from the left is nothing new. But in waiting, in holding fire, you are seeing people like, Jamie Driscoll, North of Tyne Mayor, leaving the party, being an independent, pointing out the Uturns on universal free school meals, plans to scrap tuition fees. How much longer can this go on for before there is a sizable chunk of the party that is unhappy currently with the way that they are taking the fight to the Tories?
People can't be that unhappy that we have a 15 to 20 point lead in the polls. Clearly, something is going right in taking the fight to the Tories. And I think there's an understanding in the party. We saw it at the National Policy Forum just the other weekend. The unions and the membership were willing to take the shadow cabinet's lead and go, we've got to be careful, got to be cautious. We're going to have a vision, but we actually also don't know the situation we're going to inherit. And I think there is inside the Labour Party a discipline that shows it wants to win. Now, wanting to win doesn't guarantee you win, but the consequence of indiscipline is what you see on the Tory side. Rishi Sunak tries to project to the country at large, but what he's doing all the time is trying to manage his internal coalition. He's trying to manage a coalition of MPs who represent currently 25% of all voters. Now Labour's challenge is to maintain its broad appeal to 45% of the population. Sunak is trying to hold on to 25% and strengthen a bit on the edges where it might fragment off. 2 very different approaches to the next election, one of discipline, one of focus, one maybe of waiting, and the other one of, the Tory party is we want it now, and Sunak has to keep on throwing red meat. Well, every time you find a dividing line, you find a wedge issue. I think Sunak's wedging himself against his own voters, his own potential voters, in the blue wall and the red wall.
Still, I suppose, though, Andrew, that there are only so many times that you can U-turn on a policy, announce something, and then perhaps flip-flop or prevaricate before you gain a reputation for doing so. And there are also policies that are totemic for the party. I mean, was it a mistake, for example, to pause the decision on whether or not to scrap tuition fees? Was it a mistake to not go forward with, getting rid of that 2-child benefit cap?
Yeah, I think it was. And if you look at what, say, Joe Biden, who's by no means a left winger, not on my wing of politics, much more kind of centre-left, centrist. He's doing the Debt Reduction Act in the US. He's working very much with the left of his party on the Green New Deal, big environmental investment and so on. Not doing everything I would want. I'm not going to pretend he is, but actually being a lot bolder and making an argument. And I think that's the thing that's lacking from Labour. It's not that we need, specific detailed policy mapped out, months in advance, as Jon says, from the next election. But we do need to see them making the right arguments. And at the moment, they sort of seem to be retreating from making an argument at the moment on a whole range of things. And, take tuition fees, for example. That's something that affects, 50% of young people. They're going to inherit a lifetime of debt. If you take away student debt, then you're actually giving a fiscal stimulus to the economy. You're putting more money into people's pockets so they can spend, so they can save up for a mortgage, so they can think about starting a family. There's a really positive message you can give with that policy. It's not just about the fees themselves. It's about what it means for people.
The final question for both of you is I think, pretty straightforward. Is any Labour government better than a Conservative one? Andrew?
Having watched this government over the last 2 years, I think I would conclude yes, and I think most of the public has concluded yes. That doesn't mean I'm not going to push for this incoming Labour government to be much better than what it set out so far. It needs to be clear about what the difference is with the public, and at the moment, you kind of feel like Labour and the Lib Dems, where they're winning in places like Somerton and Frome, and the Greens are picking up councils and so on, are the kind of passive receptacle of anti-Tory feeling, rather than there being this burst of enthusiasm for what they'll do. Hopefully, in the coming months and years, we'll hear that from Labour a bit more, and that's not there yet, but still, it's better than the alternative.
Passive receptacle. I'm holding on to that as an insult for someone later on today. Jon, what's your view? Any Labour government better than a Tory one?
So I think there's broad agreement on the left that it's best to have a Labour government in government with which you may be disagreeing, than having a Tory government in government with which you're actively fighting every single day.
Jon McTernan, Andrew Fisher, great to have you both on the podcast. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you.
No problem. Thanks a lot.
Jon, just identify for me then the dangers in this strategy that Rishi Sunak is pursuing at the moment. There are a number of policy flavours, if not policy, thought-out policies themselves that he's throwing around at the moment that seem, as mentioned before, designed as much to pacify those in the back benches as to appeal to the public.
The danger, the answer to your question is, of course, that these sort of attacks on green policies, issues like aggressive campaigning slogans and so on, they probably please the voters in the Red Wall and supporters of Lee Anderson, the outspoken deputy chairman of the party, but they probably horrify some middle-class Tories in the so-called Blue Wall. The danger is that the Tories, of course, are fighting the election on two fronts. They've got the Red Wall seats they're desperately trying to hold on to in the Midlands and the north of England. Labour are trying to recapture those seats, and yet in the home counties and parts of the west of England, Somerset was an example we saw a couple of weeks ago. I suppose you'd call them your middle-class professionals, your graduates, your people who voted Remain rather than Brexit. They're pretty horrified by all that. And so what the Prime Minister and the likes of Grant Shapps are saying could backfire. You cheer up the Red Wall voters, but you you alienate those in the Blue Wall.
Sure, but you're talking about the Conservatives fighting a battle on two fronts. I mean, isn't Labour ultimately doing exactly the same? I mean, once again, we heard a little bit of it in our conversation with Jon McTernan and Andrew Fisher a few minutes ago. There has always been a tension in the Labour Party between the modernising centre and the traditional left.
Of course, and there always will be. I mean, Sir Keir Starmer's coming under fire from many in the left for all sorts of reasons. There's the control freakery, stopping people like Jamie Driscoll, the left-wing mayor of North Tyneside, from standing again. The selection of Labour candidates in key seats, purge of the left, and of course the dumping of the policies that Sir Keir stood for the leadership on in 2 or 3 years ago. But I mean, I sense that Sir Keir Starmer, like Tony Blair before him, won't mind about taking on the left because it probably appeals to the voters in the centre that he wants to win over if he's going to win the general election.
I wonder if we can take advantage of that massive political brain of yours and go back to the 90s. We've been talking about Blair and New Labour and the modernising that took place within the party back then. But of course, they were in the position where, for an extended period of time, they were expected to be the next government at the time of the general election. I mean, are there parallels?
Which one are you talking about?
Well, this is the thing, Jon. 92 and 97 is the case, isn't it?
The great talking point amongst both Labour and Conservative MPs at the moment is Will the next election be like 92 or 97? Now, in 1992, Labour had big poll leads. Neil Kinnock was the leader. The late John Smith was the Shadow Chancellor. And Labour were ahead right up to the very last opinion poll. I remember it well. I was political editor of the Daily Express in the 1990s. And we, on the Express, did the last opinion poll before polling day in 92. And it showed the gap narrowing, and it was virtually neck and neck. And on polling day, it was April the 9th, 1992. John Major won with a majority of 21 when all the pundits had been predicting a Labour victory.
And wasn't this all to do with Neil Kinnock and Sheffield?
I was going to go on to say, so why did John Major win? Well, Labour would say now that they made some mistakes. The triumphalism of that Sheffield rally when Neil Kinnock went on the stage like pretending to be a rock star, I think, going, "We're all right, we're all right." And
the best Neil Kinnock impersonation I've ever heard.
He's no Bruce Springsteen, is he? Despite the fact that at party conferences, Neil Kinnock always liked a bit of late night singing at party conferences. But John Smith was the Shadow Chancellor and had produced what was called a shadow budget, which was lots of tax and spend, and that was also blamed for Labour's defeat as well. And that's why you've had since then shadow chancellors like Gordon Brown, first of all, and currently Rachel Reeves not making any spending commitments.
I'm not going to let you away without you telling me whether it's going to be 1992 or 1997 come the next general election.
Well, I think I agree with Rishi Sunak that the next election is not a done deal. That was what he said on the morning after those three by-elections. It's Labour's to lose, isn't it, at the moment, with the big poll lead. But never write off the Tories.
Well, John, at least we know we will have you every step of the way covering that general election when it finally comes, whenever that might be. And that's your lot for today. We will be back same time again tomorrow. We'll see you then.